if you join the session, it means you have interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today, I'm very happy to talk about those with disabilities and their place in the workforce. My name is Laurel Rossi. I'm the co-founder of Creative Spirit. I'm also a mother of an individual with a developmental disability, and my journey started some 19 years ago. I'd love to introduce Joanna McElnay, disability self-advocate and our community manager at Creative Spirit. And Joanna is at the forefront of everything that we do, along with her colleagues, including the disability community in all conversations having to do with unemployment. So Joanna, let's get started.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. So Laurel, this is such an important conversation. We have some great questions ahead of us, and I really want to just jump right in and get going. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So primarily, let's set the stage a little bit here for everyone. Laurel, could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to get involved in helping people in the disabilities community? And what do you feel drives your work on a personal and professional level?
As I mentioned, I got started 19 years ago when my daughter was diagnosed with a rare disease. And somewhere around 5 years into my career, I was thinking about whether I would lean into my career or lean out of it. And as I looked around the workplace, I realized that there was a big open space for people with disabilities and started to get engaged in the conversation about what happens during the transition from school to work. And it's very clear to me that we have a lot of work to do. And if you saw the title of this topic today, you'll notice that there's no place to go but forward. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. On my personal journey, I have been honored to meet hundreds of people with disabilities who are talented, able, and interested in fair wage integrated positions in the private sector, a place where I found my career for the past 30 years. I've worked in the advertising sector. I've worked in the CPG category. I've worked in financial services and now technology. And I'll simply say that anybody who is missing out on the disability community in their workplace is missing out on an entire population of people who do incredible work. And I'd like to maybe step out of some generalities and point out the fact that disability is a very wide topic. There are physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and of course, learning disabilities. And so while I haven't covered everything, the spectrum of ability within those populations is very broad. Creative Spirit places people with disability in fair wage positions, as you can imagine, just based on this topic. And what we found is that there is a pipeline of over 10 million young adults who are looking for those positions. And we'll talk a little bit about why that hasn't happened, even though the law says so, over the past 30 years.
Thank you. That was a beautiful overview. The following question I have for you is, what do you feel can be done to change the fact that only 3% of women are currently in creative director roles?
This is a topic well studied by the 3% conference, and I think that the organization has done a whole lot to actually take that percentage up. And I think that's across the board. I think there are the most senior positions that are starting to be filled, but I will also tell you the intersectionality between women, BIPOC community, and those with disabilities, among others, are incredible. And so one of the things I feel privileged to be able to talk about today is the intersectionality between disability and our community. And when I talk about disability, I'm not just talking about people with disabilities in the workforce. I'm also talking about the caregivers and allies. If you think about it, 1 in 5 in the population has a disability. If you look at the caregiving population and allies, that number is close to 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. So you could be a sibling, you could be a parent. And the strain and restrictions on you based on your job probably have something to do for a caregiver with how you work with your individual disability and do your job at the same time. And so when I think about women who really bear the disproportionate brunt of that statistic or those statistics, I feel like we need to start to talk about what it means to be a caregiver in this community and not just a worker. So really excited when I think about our tagline, what's more creative than being different? That's our Creative Spirit tagline. you can imagine the passion for the creative community and the number of folks we've placed in the creative community has been fantastic. But I will tell you, women are completely underrepresented. We only get one female candidate for every 5 male candidates at Creative Spirit.
And that's an incredible statistic. This brings up a very interesting conversation that I think you'll find as our audience very interesting. We've talked a little bit about discrimination, but let's focus in. While discrimination may be a challenge for all people, minorities specifically, we've talked a little bit about, but all people with disabilities, many women are faced with specific biases in terms of both gender and disability. How do you feel, Laurel, they can overcome these barriers, and how can Creative Spirit services support and help those in creating additional employment opportunities?
There are only 12% of companies at large in the enterprise space, in the Fortune 1000 space, those that we work with most closely, who are including people with disabilities in their DE&I agenda overtly. So let me say that again, 12% of companies are including people with disabilities in their DEI agenda. And so when you think about that, you can imagine that the best thing that we can do for these organizations is not to scold them, not to wag our finger at them by any stretch of the imagination, but to train them and remove the biases and remove the stigma attached to hiring people with disabilities in the workforce. I often liken some of the opportunity that's out there to education around nomenclature as an example. You know, it wasn't that long ago that our community, our private sector community, started to worry about, do I say Black or do I say African American? It is no different in the disability community. There is a lot of language. The number one tip I'd give everybody is people first language. So it's people with disability, those with disabilities, however you want to phrase that. But beyond that, the nomenclature shouldn't be a hang up. In fact, I think the more that organizations experiment with language and the more that they really dig into the topic, the more they'll feel like just including people with disabilities in their workplace is enough to start the dialogue and to make sure that that stigma is overcome very directly. The other thing I want to say about what we can do and what Creative Spirit has been doing is really partnering with the HR organizations and working very closely with so many men and women, lots of women in the space who are very empathetic about what it takes, not only to care for someone with a disability, but to be a person with a disability in the workforce. E-accessibility has come so far. And Joanna, you and I talk about this all the time because we access accessibility tools all the time. You teach me every single day something new I didn't even know. Yeah. And that has become a real driving force in being able to employ everyone. We are often asked about the pandemic and how did that change employment for people with disabilities? And I will say two things. In the beginning, it was rough sledding because they were the first to be let go. There was a 50% increase in the number of people with disabilities who lost their jobs. However, one of the things that caught up fairly quickly was as the workforce went mobile, people with disabilities who are digital natives, social media addicts, if you will, in a great way, are digital natives who can actually propel your business. And so we've been finding employment at an accelerated rate throughout the pandemic and really excited about that because one thing has been taken out of the mix, and that is mobility. Not having to get to a job is part of the equation in terms of accommodating people with disabilities. On the subject of accommodations, I just want to say that Creative Spirit has spent a lot of time teaching employers how to put legally enforced, legally required accommodations into place for people in their workforce. And so we really encourage employees who are already in the workforce to come forward and disclose their disability and ask for accommodations of their HR teams. And that process has been going swimmingly. And I would encourage everybody who has a disability not only to disclose in the workforce so that there's more of a focus on force, but also to be able to get what you need to do your job properly.
Absolutely, I agree. And I couldn't agree more that disclosure is really, truly the path to the future in the workforce for people with disabilities, as I myself have disclosed. So I agree. I think it's incredibly important and definitely the first step. One of the next things that I think I wanted to explore for our audience's benefit is that there's a few steps that I think that can be taken to create this paradigm shift and an authentic paradigm shift in how businesses approach hiring people with disabilities. And I'd love to understand what you think those important steps may be.
Yeah, I'd probably keep it simple, for the purposes of really educating, everyone. And I know we've got some incredible allies on this at this conference and in this session. So I want to make sure that I keep it crisp and also invite people to come back and really engage in this dialogue, not only with Creative Spirit, but with our individuals as well, who can give you firsthand account. But I'd say there are really 5 key things. Number 1, encourage disclosure. One of the things that the law provided in ADA was that you have an equal right to a fair wage job. And so with that, you are provided accommodations, and we just covered that a little bit. So I just want to say disclosure should never, never, never be a bad thing in an organization. It should be highly encouraged. Number 2, we're really looking to make sure that we start to find headcount, find numbers, understand the depth of people with disabilities in the workplace. And so you'd be surprised when I quote numbers like 1 in 5, you don't see those numbers show up in statistics. I think the National Organization on Disability said less than 4% of people actually disclose at work. And so once disclosure happens, the CHRO and the HR teams can really dig into what kind of general accommodations could be made available to everybody. And so my tip number 2, if you will, is the path to a universally designed workplace, someplace where everybody feels comfortable and included, is going to come when everybody starts to understand the depth of disability needs. Number 3 for me is education, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of some of the things Creative Spirit has been doing. We have to do more myth busting. No one believes, I take that back, 70% of the population in positions of authority believe that somebody with a disability can be as qualified as somebody without a disability for a job, and that is just patently untrue. We have placed people in developer positions, receptionist positions, manager positions, assistant manager positions in HR department. It runs the gamut. And so I just want to make sure that we debunk the myth that people with disabilities are not capable. We also should be making room, right? Number 4, we should be making room for everyone. The opportunity that we have to create a more inclusive culture across the board for a workplace. I mean, here's what's in it for everybody. If I'm sitting next to somebody that doesn't look like me, act like me, think like me, behave like me, I'm probably getting work done that's much richer, much better, and especially in the creative universe, you can imagine much more expansive than the work I was doing before. And so I really love the idea that people with disabilities and then the intersectionality of all those groups that I was talking about earlier make it a much more inclusive and fantastic place from a universal design standpoint. And then number 5, my last point is, I feel like disability has taken a backseat to so many other things. And I want to put on the table that there really is no competition in the DE&I space. The thing we really have to do is to start to advocate for everyone. And the only thing that's in the way is education.
Absolutely. And a little point that I want to underline with what you just said, which was so incredible, is ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, set up the laws that protect us. But it's us as a society that have not created a community of belonging for people with disabilities. And that's truly the next step that we need to focus on as a group of people that has power to make change. Moving on, I think one of the other incredible things, and this is a perfect segue, we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I want to understand, how do you feel the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, can be enhanced or adjusted maybe to be more effective to help women with disabilities specifically?
A couple things. ADA was put in place 31 years ago, and every single year we celebrate ADA, the signing of ADA. And there were lots of provisions that were acted upon, most of them infrastructure provisions. So if you think about cuts in the sidewalk, if you think about elevators, if you think about physical access, many of those provisions, or titles as they're called, were acted upon over the course of the time that was set out in ADA. Some of it was 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then 30 years. What hasn't happened in 30 years, and why this is so important, is Title I in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I is employment. And it basically said, please don't do us a favor and subsidize our lifestyle. Don't worry about subsidizing and compensating me for having a disability, because that is an inferior position to begin with. What really needs to happen is you need to fuel my independence by providing fair wage jobs. And so you can imagine some 31 years later, the bill and it was signed into law in 1990, that we haven't really gone very far in terms of employment. The employment numbers from 30 years ago are still exactly the same. And so both for men and women, one of the points I really like to make is, if you think about it, we have really let down an entire generation, and we're about to let down the next generation if we don't act quickly. And so there are laws. There are things that say 7% of your population must be employed and must have a disability, because that's the representation in the population that is required. And that doesn't happen today because it's not enforced. I don't think enforcement is the way forward. I think this awakening around DE&I is the opportunity to make good on a promise that we made 30 years ago. And again, if you think about women in the workforce and the impact, caregiving is hard enough as it is. If you're a caregiver to someone with a disability, it's about 50 times harder. Obesity rates are higher, stress rates are higher, suicide rates are higher, mental health rates are scarily higher, and it's very debilitating. So I'd say let's surround the women in our workforce and make sure that caregivers in particular have what they need. But more important, let's make sure that we are representing people with disabilities in the workforce as they've been promised by law. And let's make sure that this generation, the promise to this generation, is made good on.
Absolutely. That's so powerful. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. To round everything out and close out this session, we're going to end on sort of a solutions mindset. And, you're an expert, Laurel, and I truly respect your opinions on the future and your intersectionality, looking at different industries and solutions and bringing that all together for people with disabilities and finding solutions for us. So one of the things I want us to focus on for our final question is twofold. So one, is there any encouraging trends right now from the standpoint of inclusion and representation for women with disabilities in the workforce? Do you see any of these trends growing, expanding, and supporting sort of bigger changes that you would like to see personally over the next 2 years in changing the employment status quo, I guess you could say, for women with disabilities?
I do. I see some encouraging signs. I see awareness and the ability to quote statistics as being higher. So that means education is starting to work. I recently, along with Joanna, had the opportunity to interview Sandra Perino, who is the chairperson of the National Council on Disability, who put the ADA Act on the table and got it signed into law. And as a woman chairperson, especially at the time, 30 years ago, she had a vision that was very empathetic to women in the workplace. And I think that one of the things that we can be encouraged by is the fact that we may not have gotten it right over the past 30 years, but we're starting to hear in the HR communities, certainly among CEOs, that this is a hiring imperative. And I feel like the women who I've worked with, particularly in the creative community, who have disabilities, have made our work better, more informed. And while in the beginning, it was probably a little bit more stilted than we would all like, it's starting to become elegant and cohesive. And it's part of that universal design that we're all looking for. So I appreciate the question, Joanna. And I think there's no place to go but forward.
I love that. And I couldn't agree more. Thank you all for tuning in. We're really excited to be a part of the 3% conference. This is an incredible cause that's very dear to our hearts. So we're honored to be included. And Laurel, if there's any final words of wisdom or thoughts you'd like to share, I think now is the perfect opportunity.
Yeah, please feel free to reach out to creativespirit-us.org anytime, and we'd be happy to be part of your journey and education process. Thank you for having us.